Good evening, everybody, and let me thank my sister, Oramah. As she was speaking, I was wondering whether I was the one who was talking about. Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, Ambassadors, High Commissioners here, my dear sister and chairperson of the Royal African Society, Oramah, the deputy chair, Andrew, with whom we've worked for many years while he was in Hogan Lovells, Chief Executive Officer of the Royal African Society, Janet, thank you. The leadership of the Royal African Society, students, my dear friends, our colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm deeply honored and grateful to my dear sister Oramah and the leadership of the Royal African Society for the kind invitation to deliver the 2024 annual lecture. It is a high honor we value greatly. The Royal African Society has a rich history of offering a unique platform for discussions on Africa in the heart of London. It is my candid view that the role of the Society has assumed greater significance in today's Africa, as the continent transforms from years of dependency to green shoots of economic independence. We assemble here at a pivotal time in the world's history, an era where the fundamental pillars of multilateralism that drove global trade for decades have either been weakened or dismantled in preference for new protectionism, if not outright mercantilism. The future of trade-led economic development has therefore become very foggy. At a time, Africa looks up to trade as a pathway to its prosperity, as others have done in the past. How Africa navigates the uncharted waters in such a world will determine its fate for centuries. That is why the topic of today's lecture is very important. For Africa to get it right, it must first seek to understand why it is where it is in the developmental race. It must seek to understand why at every turn it is left behind in the race. It must also use the lessons of history to shape its vision and path for tomorrow. This is the proposed thrust of our discussions this evening. While time will not allow for a deeper historical excursion, this lecture will attempt to highlight some of the most significant issues relating to the state and evolution of African trade and economies, and the primary reasons for the underperformance since the 16th century and their implications. I will then end with some insights into the role of Afreximbank in the collective effort to positively change the course of Africa's history. Historically, trade had proven to be a source of good and evil. Over thousands and hundreds of years, it was trade that drove the successes achieved by the ancient Egyptians, the Phoenicians, Romans, and many European empires, such as the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British. More recently, it was trade that helped the emergence of the so-called Asian tigers as industrial economies. It was also trade that helped pull over 800 million Chinese out of poverty and turn China into a global economic powerhouse today. Even in Africa, trade played a key role in the rise of major African empires and kingdoms during the medieval period. The Songhai Empire, Old Ghana and Old Mali empires in the west of Africa, and the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, commonly referred to as Great Zimbabwe in the south, were some of the great empires and kingdoms that flourished on account of trade. It was trade that brought so much wealth to the Old Mali Empire that its early 14th century leader, Mansa Musa, is today assessed as the richest person who ever lived in this world. It was the wealth that made its capital, Timbuktu, the center of learning and architecture, attracting scholars from far and near. The level of development in Africa, primarily driven by trade, in the medieval period, were aptly captured by European seafarers as they encountered the continent for the first time. For instance, the Portuguese explorer and military commander, Pedro Álvares Cabral, marveled when he and his colleagues arrived at the island of Kewa in present-day Tanzania in 1500. He wrote, and I quote, "This island is small, near the mainland, and is a beautiful country. The houses are high, like those of Spain. In this land, there are rich merchants, and there's much gold and silver and amber and moss and pearls. Those of the land wear clothes of fine cotton and silk, and many fine things, and they are black men," unquote. Another Portuguese seafarer, Lourenço Pinto, wrote of the Kingdom of Benin in present-day Nigeria when he arrived there in 1691, and I quote, "Great Benin, where the king resides, is larger than Lisbon. All the streets run straight, and as far as the eyes can see. The houses are large, especially that of the king, which is richly decorated and has fine columns. The city is wealthy and industrious. It is so well governed that theft is unknown, and the people live in such security that they have no doors to their houses," unquote. Many African kingdoms and empires flourished on the back of trade during the period up to the 15th century. The pivotal change in the nature and structure of Africa's trade relations occurred starting from the 16th century. By that time, the Americas and the Caribbean islands had just been discovered. I use discovery in quotes, and provided vast expanse of tropical land for plantations needed to bridge the urgent calories deficit in Europe at that time. Those who study history would tell you that there was a serious food problem in Europe at that time, and they needed places to plant and get calories. To farm these plantations required abundant supply of tropical disease-resistant labor. Africa was seen as the source of that labor. The demand for African labor fueled the devastating slave trade that turned human beings into commodities. And with it, European dealers forced themselves into the hinterland and disrupted existing trade routes and trade structures. They exchanged guns, gunpowder, alcohol, and textiles for slaves. The slave trade also fueled internecine tribal and intercommunity conflicts and contributed to sowing the seed of distrust that characterizes Africa up until date. As the Industrial Revolution emerged in the mid-18th century, that's the first Industrial Revolution, and machines began to compete with labor in the plantations, the drive for abolition of slavery ensued, first in Britain, where the Industrial Revolution began. At the time the first industrial revolution started, especially Britain, was no longer interested in slavery because the machines were all produced here and they were more efficient and they expected them to take over the work of what the slaves were doing in the plantations. But on its heels came colonialism, formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, where Africa was partitioned amongst European colonial powers. It was colonialism that had the most pervasive impact on Africa, an impact that still lingers today and which has kept Africa down at the bottom of the global economic pecking order. Its deleterious consequences had also been through trade, as colonialism altered the composition, structure, and direction of Africa's trade in a dramatic manner. This structural change did not happen by chance, but through a carefully crafted strategy, as succinctly described in 1920 by Mr. Albert Sarau, a colonial administrator who wrote, and I quote, "Economically, a colonial possession means to the home country simply a privileged market, whence it withdraws the raw material it needs, dumping its own manufactures in return. Economic policy is reduced to rudimentary procedures of gathering crops and bartering them. Moreover, by strictly imposing on its colonial dependency the exclusive consumption of its manufactured products, the metropolis prevents any efforts to use or manufacture local raw materials on the spot and any contact with the rest of the world. The colony is forbidden to establish any industry, to improve itself by economic progress, to rise above the stage of producing raw materials, or to do business with the neighboring territories for its own enrichment across the custom barriers erected by the metropolitan power." Unquote. The impact of the colonial strategy on Africa's precipitous economic decline since independence in the 1960s was profound. The Ghanaian historian Professor Adu Boateng argued that colonialism denied Africa the chance to seize for themselves the tumultuous opportunities of the 20th century. Even innocuous imports, such as textiles, competed damagingly with local products, with the result that the technological gap between Africa and Europe, confined in the 15th century to shipping and firearms, widened to such an extent that African technology failed to progress. Unquote. Over 6 decades after the end of colonialism, the trade and economic structures has remained deeply rooted in the continent. Commodities remain dominant exports, while manufacturers represent a significant share of imports. For instance, in 1900, agricultural exports accounted for 49% of total merchandise exports in Nigeria. In 2023, another commodity, primary fuel commodities, accounted for over 91% of merchandise exports. At the continental level, over the last 3 decades, the share of commodities in Africa's exports has remained unchanged at about 80%. This imprint of unfortunate reality can be found across the length and breadth of the continent. The Democratic Republic of Congo, perhaps the most resource-rich nation in the world, at an estimated value of about $25 trillion US, is ironically among the top 10 poorest countries. What is the way out, you may ask? In my humble opinion, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the solution to Africa's challenges should be focused on trade. Since the origins are trade-linked, the solution must be found in trade. Reversing the colonial strategy outlined by Mr. Sarau will help to break once and for all the shackles of colonialism and allow us to take our destiny in our hands. Our own strategy should be to ensure that whatever the colonial strategy prohibited, we must work assiduously to promote. Where it's prohibited intra-African trade and integration, we must turbocharge regional trade and integration. Where it forbids local manufacturing, we must accelerate regional manufacturing and the emergence of continental supply chains. The implementation of these solutions can, however, be easier said than done. In a continent of 55 fragmented and atomistic economies, where the only glue is a political framework provided by the African Union, a continental framework to serve as an economic glue will be critical in the struggle for economic progress. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah contextualized the solution better when he wrote in his book, Africa Must Unite, published in 1963, and I quote, "The economic weakness of the new African states has been inherited from the colonial background, which subordinated their development to the needs of the colonial powers. To reverse the position and bring Africa into the realm of highly productive modern nations calls for gigantic self-help program. Such a program can only be produced and implemented by integrated planning within overall policy decided by a continental authority." And distinguished ladies and gentlemen, through extraordinary courage, hard work, and determination of African leaders, the leadership of the African Union Commission, and many others, that continental economic and trade glue emerged in 2018, when the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement was signed, bringing to life an aspiration expressed in writing by founding fathers of the Organization of African Unity, the forebear of African Union, at their inaugural meeting in 1963. It is remarkable that the agreement came into force the next year, that's in 2019, following receipt of the requisite ratifications. The AfCFTA promises to remove the fragmentation of the African economies by bringing down the 110 borders that run through its length and breadth. It promises to turn Africa from a basket case to a breadbasket of the world. With projections that it will boost intra-regional trade by $35 billion, an increase of more than 50% from current levels, while pushing regional trade levels up from 15% to 25% within a decade. In addition, the AfCFTA is expected to lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty and boost the incomes of nearly 68 million others who live on less than $5.50 a day. Boost Africa's income by $450 billion by 2035, a gain of 7%, while adding $70 billion to the income of the rest of the world. Increase Africa's exports by $560 billion, mostly in manufactures. Spur larger wage gains for women than for men. Boost wages for both skilled and unskilled workers, and other expected benefits. But the AfCFTA is a framework, a document. Installing it and making it work will require a whole lot of effort, especially financial commitment. And it is Africans who must lead this charge in this effort. Afreximbank is keenly aware of its role in that effort, mindful that one of its key purposes is to promote, facilitate, and finance intra-African trade and regional integration. It is in furtherance of the foregoing that Afreximbank made intra-African trade promotion and AfCFTA implementation a key pillar of its strategy since 2017. An intra-African Trade and Export Development Division has been created and placed under an executive vice president. We have converted intra-African trade financing from a high-risk business to a bankable proposition. The bank disbursed a cumulative amount of over $20 billion in support of intra-African trade between 2017 and 2021. and we are on track to double this amount to $40 billion in the 5 years from 2022 to 2026. In the process, inter-African trade financing share of Afreximbank credit portfolio has risen from 3% in 2016 to 31% in 2023. With Afreximbank estimated to account for almost 15% of all bank intermediated inter-African trade financing in 2023. In supporting the LCFT implementation, we've also paid special attention to the priorities set out by the founding fathers of the Organization of African Unity at their inaugural meeting in 1963. These priorities are as drawn from the excerpts of the resolution of this meeting, in which they committed to establish a free trade area among the various African countries, to establish a common external tariff to protect the emergent industries and set up a raw material price stabilization fund, to develop trade among African countries by the organization and participation in African trade fairs and exhibitions, and granting transport and transit facilities, to establish a Pan-African payment and clearing union, and to progressively free national currencies from all non-technical external attachments and the establishment of a Pan-African monetary zone. We are pleased that after 60 years of inaction, Afreximbank has played a key role in delivering some of these priorities. In this regard, working with the AFCFTA Secretariat of the African Union Commission and some African central banks, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System has been launched and is now operational. With 42 currencies and payment systems, inter-African trade cannot be expected to operate efficiently. That is why the continent expends over $5 billion in payment charges and waits much longer than normal to conclude intra-African payments. PAPS is drastically reducing these charges, cutting transfer charges by as much as 80% and effecting intra-regional payments in seconds rather than days and in African currencies. Afreximbank backs the payment system with a settlement fund of $3 billion. With this system, a Kenyan farmer can access his or her favorite Nollywood movie, paying for it in Kenyan shilling. The system is therefore domesticating intra-African trade payments, opening a tremendous opportunity for boosting intra-African trade in goods and services, integrating SMEs in export supply chains, and boosting manufacturing. 15 African central banks, about 150 commercial banks, and 13 switches have signed on to this system, with the expectation to reach 20 central banks by year-end or thereabout. An African currency marketplace has also been launched, and piloting is underway in Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya. This marketplace allows for trading African currencies, creating a window for the repatriation of trapped funds in different African countries. Also, a PAPS card scheme will soon be launched, which will make it possible for card holders to spend their own national currencies as they travel across Africa. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we envisage a new era for inter-African business engagements as PAPS takes root. We expect this platform to support regional air travels, African direct investment, and intra-regional contracting services for infrastructure projects. And in collaboration with the AFCFTA Secretariat and African Union Commission, Afreximbank has also launched the biennial Inter-African Trade Fair in November 2018. The trade fair is a key instrument intended to break the information barrier that continues to hamper intra-African trade. 3 of the trade fairs had been held since 2018, with cumulative attendance of over 70,000 people and deals closed amounting to over $120 billion. The trade fair complements the digital initiative of the bank under its Africa Trade Gateway platform. The platform offers access to KYC and AML information on thousands of African businesses, uses artificial intelligence to predict supply chains and provide market intelligence and market information. It also integrates in one place the economic, trade and investment regulations across 55 African countries, so that those who want to know what is going on in other countries do not have to visit 55 websites. It also offers a B2B and B2G marketplace that is AFCFTA compliant. It also tackled the transit problem identified by African leaders in 1963. Working with the AFCFTA Secretariat and the Commercial Secretariat, we have launched an Africa Collaborative Transit Guarantee Scheme to ensure a seamless movement of goods across Africa's 110 borders. The scheme is under implementation in the commercial region in partnership with ZEP-RE, with whom a transit guarantee joint venture has been launched. And with this scheme, it is possible for a truck to move from Cape to Cairo without stopping because of transit issues. And Afreximbank commitment so far in this transit guarantee scheme is in an amount of about $1 billion and covers not only transit bonds and guarantees, but also other trade facilitation instruments such as container guarantee intended to significantly reduce logistic costs. Beyond the foregoing priorities carefully identified by the founding fathers of the African OAU in 1963, Afreximbank is doing much more in support of the AFCFTA implementation and African integration. In this regard, Afreximbank is working with the African Union Commission, the AFCFTA Secretariat, and African Organization for Standards to harmonize standards for a seamless implementation of the trade agreement. Through Afreximbank direct grant funding and those it helped to mobilize, over 500 standards covering pharmaceuticals, medical devices, various medical products, textiles, leather, and automotives have been harmonized and issued. And work continues on other priority sectors identified by the AFCFTA Council of Ministers of Trade. Given that standards without adequate quality infrastructure will be useless, Afreximbank is building testing, inspection, and certification centers across Africa through its subsidiary called the Africa Quality Assurance Center. One center has been opened in Ogun State in Nigeria, and others are being developed in Kenya, Benin, Togo, Gabon, Egypt, and so on. Over the next 2 years, an investment of $100 million is envisaged in support of these projects. And to accelerate the AFCFTA implementation at this early stage, Afreximbank, the AFCFTA Secretariat, and Arise Integrated Industrial Platform have set up the AFCFTA Trading Company to lead regional trade under the bank's Export Trading Companies initiative. The trading companies to be created under this initiative, acting as aggregators, will help expand sub-regional and continental value chains and support the development of local economies, thereby lifting millions out of poverty. It is this trading company that the Council of Ministers of the AFCFTA has given the mandate to spearhead the trading of goods under the agreement until all the protocols have been domesticated. The bank is also backing this initiative with a trade finance facility envisaged to reach $1.5 billion. It is envisaged that a shipping subsidiary of the trading company focused on African coastal and inland shipping will follow, so as to significantly reduce shipping, logistics, and other bottlenecks that constrain intra-African trade. Afreximbank has also created the Engineering, Procurement, and Construction Financing Program, through which it supports African corporates in bidding for and executing public and private sector projects, which used to be the preserve of foreign companies. Over the last few years, we have helped African entities win public sector projects amounting to about $13 billion. Mindful that many low-income African countries use import tariffs as a source of fiscal revenues rather than as an instrument of trade policy, the bank has collaborated with the AFCFTA Secretariat to launch the AFCFTA Adjustment Fund under a mandate of the African Union Summit. Headquartered in Kigali, Rwanda, the fund has components that compensates eligible countries for tariff revenue losses arising from the new trading regime. It also supports public and private sector entities in LCFTA participating states to adapt to and to better be prepared to participate in the new regime. And convinced that the pathway for Africa is through significant investment in industrial infrastructure, Afreximbank, through its subsidiary, the Fund for Export Development in Africa, is also proactively championing the continent's industrialization agenda, with increased investments in industrial infrastructure and value addition, capitalizing on the abundant commodities on the continent. The bank, through its investee company, Arise Integrated Industrial Platform, has invested about $2 billion in the development of special economic zones that are already creating export manufacturing hubs across Africa. While the target is to create 100,000 hectares of industrial estate in 7 years, Arise Integrated Industrial Platform, with debt and equity financing support from Afreximbank Group, has created just under 20,000 hectares of such estates today. The Gabon Special Economic Zone, which focuses on the timber industry, has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors, and enabled Gabon to move from being an exporter of logs to the world's second largest sustainable producer and exporter of vineyard, as well as the first in Africa. The Glojibo Industrial Zone in the Benin Republic is dedicated to the local transformation of agricultural products, including cotton, cashew nuts, pineapples, shea nuts, and soybeans. There is also the Adetikope Industrial Platform in Togo, which concentrates on the local transformation of agricultural products and exporting. Also up and running are special economic zones in Chad, which processes meat and actually exports them all the way down to Angola and Central Africa. There are also industrial parks that are operating in Rwanda. Those other developments are industrial zones in Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, Malawi, Republic of Congo, etc. The bank is also working with the UN Economic Commission for Africa and the Rise Integrated Industrial Platform to create special industrial zones in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia to produce EV batteries. This will convert these two countries that jointly account for 70% of global cobalt production to exporters of battery precursors. It is a program that we've done with UNECA, which is accompanied with a trade policy that harmonizes how they treat tariffs or export duties imposed on those who export raw cobalt, raw copper, and other battery minerals. Yeah. Afreximbank is also pursuing an ambitious strategy to catalyze production, trade, and investment in Africa's culture and creative industries through the Creative Africa Nexus. And this program is backed by a $2 billion funding commitment from Afreximbank. By implementing a range of financing and non-financial instruments, the program aims to increase Africa's share of global cultural trade flows and deploy resources to raise the quality of local production to international standards. CANEX also focuses on the reform and harmonization of legal protections, including intellectual property rights and incentives. And we must thank the Royal African Society for a partnership in the implementation of CANEX. When I have focused on geographic Africa, I would like to remind us all that our definition of intra-African trade puts a heavy emphasis on the N in intra-African. Accordingly, we support the integration of the African diaspora with the motherland through our Global Africa initiative. The Caribbean economies are now participating in the bank, which has enabled us to start implementing over $2.4 billion in pipeline in the region. Within 2 years of our engagement with the Caribbean, we opened an office there, and just this June, we had an annual general meeting there. We have supported the countries through adaptation financing that have gone to some of the countries that had suffered from damages from hurricane. We've also created opportunities for investments by African investors in many of the countries. And the investment we have created is in excess of about $1 billion, covering port infrastructure, and as well as tourism and manufacturing activities. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, although Afreximbank continues to support, there's a limit to what it can aim to achieve due to resource constraints. That's why it's important to put on the table the issue of financing Africa's development. We believe that Africa's minerals under the ground, unexploited, is a waste. They do not bring immediate funding for financing critical development, nor are they accounted for in national income accounts to create more borrowing headroom. African countries must therefore find very quick ways of monetizing those resources, including through prepayment facilities and other mechanisms that transfer the risk to those who can bear them and raise funds for countries to invest in critical development programs as quickly as possible. It doesn't make sense to keep your minerals under the ground. The minerals may become obsolete, or their use may become obsolete, and the valuable minerals today will become useless minerals tomorrow. I think even if you don't have anything to invest the funding you get by finding ways to monetize them today, better you put them in US Treasury bills. Because the investments you make today to begin to move from commodities to more dynamic sectors is what will change the course of Africa's development. We must also ensure that we take control of our financial system to enable us to finance the projects and transactions that matter to us. We cannot continue to outsource our future to others. The problem we have on the continent is that our banks are owned by foreigners. Whereas if you go to America, American banks are owned by Americans. European banks are owned by Europeans. Chinese banks are owned by Chinese. Why is it that it's only in Africa that African banks are owned by others? So if an African wants to borrow, the credit committee that looks at it is somewhere else. And if the name sounds so exotic, the risk is assessed as very high. So we think we must do everything to create and strengthen our financial system and take control. And we're not saying we should not have foreign banks, but we are saying that, as happens in other countries where the nationals control over 80% of the banking assets, Africa should try to do so, because that is the only way we can increase access to financing to SMEs and other businesses on the continent. I think Nigeria is a very good example of what that kind of policy can do. Let me conclude by saying that Africa remains a potentially prosperous continent. despite the vastness of the resources extracted and taken out to develop other parts of the world. We still possess a sizable volume of these natural resources. We must use them to transform our economies. Africans must look inward for solutions to the developmental challenges confronting our continent. I think we had 60 years of independence. We can no longer blame any person for our situation. It is up to us to break away from the course of the proverbial goat that has been untethered but refused to live where it is tethered. In that regard, we must consciously rally around the AfCFTA, pool resources to scale investments in industrial infrastructure, and build a strong continental and national financial system. I will finally close with a quote from the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies of May 5, 2023. They wrote of the reality of the world today in the following words, and I quote, "The world is witnessing a new mercantilist moment. The free trade ideas are being replaced. It's not simple protectionism, much less the promotion of autarky. It is the return of our old vision that links the prosperity of states to their military, industrial, financial, or technological power, and uses trade policy as a tool to secure these goals. Goals such as economic security, energy, autonomy, resilience of supply chains, or technological supremacy are more relevant today in the design of domestic and foreign economic policies than the embracement of free markets and the maintenance of a rule-based, open global economy. Africa must be guided by these words." I thank you for this opportunity.